Imagine a town gripped by an unshakable fear, where people refuse to leave their homes after dark, their nights filled with dread. In the spring of 1946, the border city of Texarkana was terrorized by a mysterious hooded figure who became known as the Phantom Killer. The nightmare began on February 22, 1946. A young couple parked on a quiet lover's lane was attacked by a masked man. They survived, but this was just the beginning. Over the next 10 weeks, the Phantom would strike again and again, targeting couples in secluded areas, turning Texarkana's nights into a living horror story. 2 weeks later, another couple wasn't as lucky. Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were found murdered in their car, shot execution style. Panic spread. People bought guns, locked their doors, and a curfew was enforced. The town felt like it was under siege. Just 3 weeks after the last attack, on the night of April 14, 1946, the Phantom returned with a chilling new level of brutality. The victims this time were 17-year-old Paul Martin and 15-year-old Betty Jo Booker. For Betty Jo, the evening had begun with the bright lights and lively sounds of the VFW club, where she played saxophone with her band, the Rhythmaires. She was a gifted musician, full of life and promise. After the show, she met up with Paul, a close friend of the Phantom's previous victim, Richard Griffin. They drove off into the night, unaware they were driving into a meticulously laid trap. The next morning, Paul Martin's body was discovered lying in a ditch on a desolate stretch of North Park Road. He had been shot 4 times. His car was found abandoned miles away, the keys still dangling from the ignition, a silent testament to the abruptness of the violence. But Betty Jo was missing. A frantic search began, combing the woods and fields as a knot of dread tightened around the community. Hours later, the search ended in heartbreak. Betty Jo's body was found nearly 2 miles from Paul's, lying behind a thicket of trees. She had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the face. Nearby lay her saxophone case, a poignant symbol of a life and a talent extinguished far too soon. With this double murder, the town's fear metastasized into full-blown terror. This was no longer a series of isolated incidents. It was the work of a single, predatory killer. But the Phantom's reign of terror was far from over, and his next attack would shatter every remaining illusion of safety. On the evening of May 3rd, the killer changed his methods entirely, moving away from the secluded lovers' lanes and targeting a family in the sanctity of their own home. Virgil Starks, a 65-year-old farmer, was relaxing in his favorite armchair inside his rural farmhouse, reading the evening paper. His wife, 56-year-old Katie, was in another room. The quiet domestic scene was violently interrupted by the sound of shattering glass and 2 sharp cracks. Virgil slumped over, shot twice in the back of the head through the closed window. He died instantly. Hearing the noise, Katie initially thought a jar had fallen and broken. She called out to Virgil but received no answer. As she walked into the living room, she saw him motionless in his chair. In a state of confusion and panic, she reached for the telephone to call the sheriff. But as she did, she saw him. A tall, hulking figure standing just outside the back door, a crude white sack pulled over his head with holes cut out for his eyes. Before she could scream, he raised his pistol and fired twice through the screen door. The bullets tore through her face, shattering her jaw and teeth. She fell to the floor, pretending to be dead as the killer tried and failed to force his way inside. Miraculously, Katie Starks survived. Fueled by sheer will and adrenaline, she waited until she heard the killer leave. Then, clutching her horrifically wounded face, she stumbled out of the house and ran in her blood-soaked nightgown across a dark field to a neighbor's farm for help. Her survival was a pivotal moment in the case. Not only did she live to tell the tale, but she provided law enforcement with the first and only detailed eyewitness description of the man who would forever be known as the Phantom Killer. The sheer terror gripping Texarkana demanded an unprecedented response. Law enforcement from both sides of the state line, Texas and Arkansas, flooded the city, a frantic attempt to cage an invisible predator. The situation escalated to the point where the legendary Texas Rangers were called in, led by the famous and formidable Captain M.T. Lone Wolf Gonzalez. He arrived with a swagger and a promise: "I'll get this man, and I'll get him if I have to get him out of the grave." But the Phantom was unlike any criminal they had ever faced. The jurisdictional nightmare of a city split between two states created chaos and communication breakdowns, giving the killer a crucial advantage. While officers argued over protocols, the Phantom was planning his next move, always one step ahead. The few who survived his onslaught provided a chilling, albeit fragmented description. He was a tall man, but his most terrifying feature was the crude white mask he wore to conceal his identity. Most accounts described it as a simple pillowcase or a flour sack, with two rough holes cut out for his eyes. This simple, almost childishly crafted disguise became the stuff of nightmares. It was the faceless embodiment of a random, motiveless evil. The press, seizing on his elusiveness, dubbed him the Phantom Killer, a name that echoed in whispered conversations and blared from radio broadcasts, cementing his status as a local boogeyman. The image of that masked figure, lurking in the shadows, would be seared into the collective memory of Texarkana for generations. As the attacks continued, a palpable paranoia descended over the city. By nightfall, the once bustling streets fell silent. Residents turned their homes into fortresses, nailing boards over windows and installing complex new locks. The sale of firearms, ammunition, and watchdogs skyrocketed. People who had never owned a gun in their lives were now sleeping with loaded pistols on their nightstands. Teenagers were forbidden from going out, and the popular lovers' lanes, once a symbol of youthful romance, became desolate and feared. A self-imposed curfew took hold, far more effective than any official decree. Friday nights were no longer for celebration, but for hunkering down and praying for sunrise. Captain Gonzalez and his multi-state task force threw everything they had at the case. They established roadblocks on every major artery in and out of the city, stopping and questioning thousands of motorists. Officers went door to door, conducting hundreds of interviews and chasing down every rumor, no matter how outlandish. A massive pinboard at headquarters became a tangled web of photos, maps and strings connecting victims and potential sightings. Rewards were offered, totaling over $7,000, a small fortune at the time. But the tips that poured in were a deluge of false accusations, mistaken identities, and dead ends. The Phantom left behind precious little physical evidence, and the investigation, for all its manpower, was spinning its wheels. Eventually, the investigation zeroed in on a primary suspect, a habitual car thief named Ul Swinney. His criminal record and physical description made him a person of interest. The case seemed to solidify when his own wife confessed he was the killer, but she later recanted her story. Without her testimony, the evidence was too weak to secure a murder indictment. Swinney was convicted on unrelated charges, but never for the Moonlight murders. With their main suspect out of reach, other theories persisted. Was the killer a transient who passed through? Or could the variations in the attacks suggest more than one killer? In the end, the questions remained. The Phantom Killer vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving a town forever scarred by the spring of 1946. After the murder of Virgil Starks on May 3, 1946, the attacks simply ceased. The Phantom Killer, who had held Texarkana in a grip of suffocating fear for 10 agonizing weeks, vanished as mysteriously as he had first appeared. The summer nights grew quiet, but it was an unnerving, watchful silence. The massive law enforcement presence eventually scaled back, leaving a wounded community to grapple with the aftermath. The terror didn't disappear, it simply moved behind locked doors. For the first time, residents who had never locked their doors now secured them with bolts and chains. Gun sales soared as people armed themselves against a faceless threat. A self-imposed curfew took hold, with streets emptying as the sun dipped below the horizon. The word sundown was no longer just a time of day, it was a palpable warning. This collective trauma became woven into the fabric of the town, a boogeyman story told to succeeding generations, a permanent psychological scar on the community's psyche. 30 years later, that scar was ripped open when the local legend was catapulted onto the world stage. In 1976, director Charles B. Pierce released The Town That Dreaded Sundown, a docudrama that seared the Phantom story into horror cinema. Filmed on location, it gave Texarkana a new, grim identity, forever branding it for the world and cementing the Phantom's legacy as a national icon of true crime. But notoriety could never provide what the town truly craved: answers. To this day, the Moonlight murders remain officially unsolved. The case files are a labyrinth of dead ends and tantalizing theories. The most prominent suspect was UL Swinney, a career criminal whose own wife implicated him, only to later recant her testimony. Without her as a credible witness, murder charges could never be filed. This lack of resolution is the Phantom's cruelest legacy. It leaves a void filled with chilling, unanswerable questions. Who was the man behind the mask? Was he a local who walked the streets in daylight, living out his life among the very families he terrorized? And the most haunting question of all, why did he stop? Did he die, get locked away, or did he simply move on, taking his violent compulsions to another unsuspecting town, under another moonlit sky? The Texarkana Moonlight murders remain one of America's most terrifying unsolved mysteries. A phantom who stepped out of the shadows, claimed lives, and then vanished forever. If you want more haunting mysteries and unsolved true crime stories, make sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover the darkest secrets of history.